Good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And on behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all of us at the Hutchins Center, and Professor David Stern and the Center for Jewish Studies, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this virtual space for what promises to be a provocative and energizing and totally engaging discussion between Michael Twitty and Tema Smith, called Not That Far Apart, Black and Jewish Identities in Intersection. This is the second installment of our two centers collaboration, Black and Jewish, a talk series. To those of you joining us for the first time, welcome. And for those of you returning, welcome back. One housekeeping item, please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. We ask that you keep them brief as we anticipate that there will be many questions. The Q&A will be moderated by Saul Zaret, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations. Now it's my pleasure to say a few words about Tema Smith and Michael Twitty, who will be in conversation with one another this afternoon. Tema Smith is a diversity advocate, writer, and Jewish community builder. She is currently the Director of Professional Development at 18 Doors, formerly Interfaith Family. This comes after 7 years as a synagogue professional, most recently as the Director of Community Engagement at Holy Blossom Temple, Toronto's oldest synagogue. Tema is also a contributing columnist at The Forward, whose writing has been published in My Jewish Learning, The Globe and Mail, and the Canadian Jewish News. She has worked to advance the conversation on racially diverse Judaism, teaming with organizations like Bechol Lashon and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and she speaks and trains frequently on racial equity and diversity for synagogues and Jewish organizations across North America. In fact, some of us in the Boston area here may be familiar with her from her work with the Boston Jewish Community Relations Council. Michael W. Twitty is a culinary historian and food writer from the Washington, D.C. area. He blogs at afroculinaria.com and has appeared on Bizarre Foods America with Andrew Zimmern, Taste the Nation with top chefs Padma Lakshmi, and my personal favorite, Many Rivers to Cross, with my boss, Henry Louis Gates Jr. His first book, The Cooking Gene, in 2017, traced his ancestry through food from Africa to America and from slavery to freedom. It was a finalist for the Kirkus Prize and the Art of Eating Prize, and a third place winner of Barnes & Noble's Discover New Writers Awards in nonfiction. In 2018, with The Cooking Gene, he became the first Black author to win the coveted 2018 James Beard Award for Best Writing, as well as Best Book of the Year. His piece on visiting Ghana in Bon Appetit was included in Best Food Writing in 2019 and was nominated for a 2019 James Beard Award. And just last month, UNC Press published the book Rice as a part of their Savor the South cookbook series, in which he explores Rice's culinary history and African diasporic roots through 51 delicious-looking recipes. I intend to try some of those before Passover, I think. Next year, we'll see the publication of Kosher Soul, his follow-up to The Cooking Gene. Michael has a very popular spice line and made a recent special guest appearance on Michelle Obama's Waffles and Mochi show on Netflix. Please join me now in welcoming Tema Smith and Michael Twitty to the Black and Jewish Talk series. Thank you.
Hi, it's so good to be with you, Michael.
Hi, Fred. Hey, cousin.
So it's just such an honor, really, to be invited to be in conversation with you today. We always have such great talks when we have the opportunity to connect, which unfortunately is nowhere near often enough. So I'm glad that we get to spend some time, bringing people into the universe that we sort of create. And it's really just exciting to be with you.
Likewise. I feel like I'm with the Queen of Twitter at the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah, Jewish Twitter. And it's, it's just so great to sort of bring together the topics that we talk about really, but really like our full showing up in sort of the fullness of our identities to really share how we occupy space, how we think about ourselves and our histories and you know, the ways that these things connect, and how we sort of view our Jewish world, our Black world, our Black Jewish world, and it's just you know, I can keep saying it's an honor, and it's an honor, and I'm so grateful for the invitation from Harvard to
Yes.
do this with you. So I guess that's just like a whole bunch of excitement right now coming out of me, and we should really dive into like the meaty stuff so that we can get that conversation going. So I guess I'll share a little bit about myself and how I come to this conversation, and then Michael, I'll invite you to do the same about yourself. So me, my mother is an Ashkenazi Jewish white Torontonian. My father, his family comes from the Bahamas originally, but my dad was born and raised in New York. As a Black man in America, he moved to Canada in 1980. Moved back with my mom, and my brother and I were born in Toronto, grew up sort of mixed race kids in the most diverse city in the world, but largely outside of the formal Jewish community. So my world was very multiracial, very diverse, but not very Jewish growing up. And long story short, I explored, I became a Jewish professional, and now spend all of my time trying to create space for people like me to occupy Jewish space and show up as our whole selves, not just sort of doing Jewish in a Jewish space and not the other parts of our identity. And Michael and I were so lucky to meet through, we were introduced through B'chol Lashon when Michael was in Toronto for Ashkenaz Festival a number of years ago, and just hit it off instantly, and just, it was like a mind meld. So Michael, do you want to talk a little bit more about what brings you to the conversation?
Sure. I am identify as African American because I am. But I think a lot of my career is about getting out of the bubble, getting out of the box. Because I think what a lot of people do is they have this one vision for how Black Jews exist. And I've even had my own little acronym, which I don't think is going to catch on anytime soon. Blacks involved, or Blacks in Judaism, because there's so many different formats. I mean, there are people who are, I don't necessarily identify like the term biracial because, you know, whatever the connotations, but people who are mixed, people who do have a parent who is Jewish, African American, or Jewish, Black, Caribbean, whatever. And then there are people who convert. And then there are people who convert, but they have significant Jewish ancestry that is not halakhic. That's a whole other category, you know. And then, of course, the people who were raised and born Jewish, whatever the hell that means, for generations. And they're not just, and they're Hasidic, and they're Reconstructionist, and they're Reform, and they're, you know, our community is Reconstructionist rabbis who are friends with Hasidic rabbis, you know, and and they're all Black. And they all have these stories. And it's so important that people understand that compartmentalization that we do. I say we're Venn diagrams, and we're not uncommon. We're not really the outliers that people think we are.
Right.
So when I was in my early 20s, I became part of the Jewish community, Sephardic Jewish community in Washington, D.C. I had an Orthodox baked in, but at the same point in time, I came into it with knowing that I had Jewish ancestry in my family, which after I've done all these hoops, jumped through all these hoops with the cooking gene, found out, oh yeah, it was in there, like, you know, like spaghetti, like Prego spaghetti sauce, it was in there. And for me, it's like, at this point in my life, I feel like I've stopped answering the question, so how come are you Jewish? So what got you to Judaism? Because I understand, like everybody else, Judaism is the religious arm of Jewish civilization. We're people first, regardless of anything else. We're people first, and that fact means that after spending 15 years in Hebrew school classrooms teaching, from Orthodox to Independent Havara and Jewish Renewal, I'm in it. I've spent more time on this planet Jewish than I have not Jewish, and so therefore I think the conversation isn't, so how did I get here? Where's my spiritual green card, or where's my mishpacha green card? But what have I done since I've been here?
Right.
And I think that's the conversation that we're going to have today, is about what that existence means, not just in terms of religious practice, spiritual practice, but in just being part of a people and being part of two peoples upon whom the original sins of the West are based.
Right.
Racism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I really like the way that you sort of foregrounded that piece around, first of all, the expansiveness of Jewish peoplehood that's always been extremely expansive, you know, right in Torah, a mixed multitude left Egypt together, and presumably some of those people made their way into the Israelites as they became the Jews. So, you know, that's baked right into our history right there. But also, that the way that you framed it, it's not about how you came to Judaism. It's about what you've done in community, in Jewish peoplehead. And I think, you know, when I think about this conversation, and I think about the conversation around race and Judaism, so much of I think what makes for uncomfortable conversations that we've all been in is the question that focuses not on that, like you said, more of your life that's been spent in Jewish community than not, but people want to know about the other part. People want to know how you got to community. And it's you know, it is a curiosity question. I think it's a problematic curiosity question because it's quite intrusive. But you know, what I think is interesting about your framing here is that you really are saying, you know, yeah, we can talk about how I came to connect to Judaism, how I came to become Jewish. Like, I was born Jewish, all the problematicness of that term, but you know, I have an Ashkenazi Jewish mother, so my Jewish identity has never been called into question in any way. Not to say that I haven't faced, I'll call them macroaggressions about the fact that I come from an interfaith, interracial family. But you know, of course, that's an experience. But I think, you know, when we think about it and think about identity, think about belonging, thinking about community, thinking about our identities in intersection, as this talk was titled, that focus on our existence as part of this peoplehood is a much richer place to spend time than like, and I discovered Judaism because even though I was born Jewish, we were cultural Jews. If people saw me as a child, they would never expect that I would one day like write about Judaism, study Judaism, work in the community, all of these pieces. And I think, you know, we have a great opportunity to really like dive in. And so you sent me a few things that you really wanted to talk about, and they got me really excited. So I'm going to start there because I think the first one I think is going to help sort of bring what we've been sort of dancing around to light. And you know, the title of this talk was Black and Jewish Identities in Intersection, or Black and Jewish Not That Far Apart. So not that far apart, Black and Jewish Identities in Intersection. This is what happens when I don't print the title. But you know, when we say not that far apart, what does that mean to you?
It means that we're not the antipodes, that, you know, the human antipodes that people think we are. That's what it means. It's you know, it's kind of also a running joke in American popular culture. You know, even though the sign said no blacks, no Jews, no dogs. You know, if you were from outer space, I hate that saying that, but it's true. If you were from outer space and someone said, okay, who in American culture, who's farthest apart? You think it was the blacks and the Jews. You know, despite the fact that we've had a lot of babies together. You know, despite the fact that we've been in some of the same places fighting for some of the same things, despite the fact that the food, which is, you know, what I do, tells very similar stories about both peoples. Again, I use the model of the Venn diagram.
Right.
It's here, it's in this space, and it's also in a shared space. And so I just want people to sort of rethink. I mean, and I think that folks who kind of like get themselves out of the realm of popular culture and to put themselves back in it. Because look, I don't mean to go too far on a tangent, but I'm Black, I'm gay, and I'm Jewish. Tangents are a thing with me. They're baked into the cake, right? And it's like this. A couple of days ago, I just kept thinking to myself about I'm not going to say the words, but the movie Full Metal Jacket and its effect on the intersection of misogyny and anti-Asian stuff, and how it diminished the brains, the bodies, the beings of Asian women. And I'm like, you can't like ignore that stuff. That stuff has an effect for generations, for years to come. And so a lot of times with Black Jewish folks, I've heard, as you probably heard, the Sammy Davis Jr. comment more than once.
Yes.
He was the only one. Forgetting the fact that there are lots of people out there who have to share the same exact identity as you in terms of being daughters and sons of Ashkenazi women who have African American or Black husbands or partners, and it's just like there's a lot of people you don't know are Jewish that are Jewish out there.
Yes.
And then of course there's this idea that sure, there's this synergy, there's this energy, there are these vibes, but it's subcutaneous. It's not really, not more than skin deep. And I would beg to differ. There is a serious blood and bone there between the way that so Jews and Blacks, remember I'm saying together and apart, have expressed themselves, have had to deal. Like I've said before, we represent the two original sins of the West. I'm going to say right quick that yes, ableism and misogyny are universal, so we ain't gonna keep it to the West. But the original sins of the West, unique to the West, have been anti-Semitism in the form that it's taken, and anti-Blackness in the form that it has taken. And so therefore, we're kind of working with the same territory. And for people like us who have, represent this rainbow of Black Jewish identities, it's what makes life complicated. So that when I talk about food and I talk about some of the issues and politics around that, people sometimes will go, it's not that deep. And I say, oh yeah, it is. Because when I come to the table, when I come to the plate, when I come to create something for people to eat, or for myself and my husband to eat, or our families to eat, I'm working through a kind of a trauma behind those dishes and the ideas behind them and the foods behind them that other people are not. So therefore, when you see folks get up in arms about that food and the food politics and the cultural politics, the culinary politics, it's because we don't have the same journey to the table. And as you know, in Jewish tradition, the table is the mizbeach, the altar of the mikdash me'at. The house is a little temple, as a sanctuary. And it's in parallel to the ways that in Black culture, the home is a sanctuary from the anti-Blackness that world, or could be or should be, ain't always. And the kitchen is both of the hearth and the heart of the home. It's where the cooking gets done, where the hair gets done, where the dominoes get played, where the cards get played, where the conversations happen, where the prayers happen, when people laugh, when people argue, when people cook, people eat. And it's that kind of like intersection between those two worlds. The idea of the table is a sacred space where moral suasion and ethical issues are mitigated through food, and also the space where tradition and cultural survival is mitigated through recipes, where I find myself the happiest.
Right. It's so interesting, and I wish that I could draw out, comment back on everything you said, because there's just so much richness in all of the things you said, but time is limited, so I'm going to cherry pick a couple. One is this idea of the kitchen being a place to work through trauma. And obviously Passover is on my mind. It's coming up this weekend. And figure it's something that I've never really thought that deeply about. It's like we go through the motions of preparing the food for the Seder, and then the Seder is the time when we work through the traumas and the history and whatever. And with my family, it always does also talk about our Black identities and how my Black family got to the Caribbean, which is the same way that Black Americans got to America. And that is part of our conversation. But I'm just thinking about actually, what would it mean? And maybe it is part of actually just the experience of like when we make karotza, right? Like it's like sweet and it's, you know, rich and it's all of these things, but it's it represents the mortar for you know, the Israelites' time enslaved. And so there is something about that ritual of preparing that is sort of working through that history in a really meaningful way. And another piece I just want to sort of draw on is this idea of not that far apart, and this idea that these our communities have been sort of, and when I say our communities, I mean Black and Jewish, have been sort of put out there as these diametrically opposed things, which ignores the overlap, which is significant and historic, number one. And I think of, you know, like you mentioned, there are so many Jewish Black couples who have had children, and historic Black Jewish communities, and people who have made their way into the Jewish people in all sorts of ways. So that overlap, of course, says not that far apart. But also I think of it on a very personal level. I don't think that I could sit here and parse out, well, this is the Black part of my identity, and this is the Jewish part of my identity. And, you know, between those two is this like space that's a no man's land. That's absolutely not it. And when I think of what it means to occupy space, and for me, most of the space that I occupy as a Jewish professional, as somebody who writes in Jewish media, is Jewish space. I'm always occupying it as somebody who is Black and Jewish, and Canadian and a woman, or I should say a dual citizen, but I am sitting in Toronto right now, you know, and a woman, and, you know, all of these sort of pieces. And this idea, when I think of this expectation that you can sort of tease out these bits of your identity to show up in different spaces in different ways, that's absurd. And, you know, it's very funny. It is a question that comes up often. People are like, well, how do you feel as when you occupy this space? Or how do you feel in Black community as a Jew? I'm like, you know what? I'm showing up as my whole self, no matter what community I'm in. And, you know, what does that look like? What does that mean? Is going to change based on who's in that room, not that here I'm with some Black people and here I'm with some Jewish people. It's about the individuals.
Although I do code switch, and and maybe
Yeah.
you do too. And but that's another thing that people don't understand, is that's also a very deep part. I think of both, but it's more articulated with Black culture.
Yeah.
About, you know, I remember when I was at Howard University and I started taking classes at American University in Jewish Studies, and I was like as a part of the consortium program. And you remember that story a couple of weeks ago that came out through Twitter about conversational overlapping?
Yes.
And I remember the first time I did that in a Black space, predominantly Black space, that was not Jewish. I should also say that the Black space can be a Jewish space, but this wasn't one.
Yes.
And I remember what it was like to be in class and sort of do that, because I was at American. That was, you know, that was the thing, and it was just an American. Ladies and gentlemen, I grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland, the home of 60% of the DC area is Jews. I didn't grow up with Jewish people on the other side of the moon. I grew up with the sukkah everybody had a sukkah in the backyard. This was not spectacular. We got off of school for the major Jewish holidays where I grew up. So this was not I wasn't from some other world. So having said that, this was a part of my entire existence, not just those classes. And I remember being in Howard one time, and one of the classes of one of my favorite professors no longer here with us. And I remember doing some conversation overlap. It did not go over well. It was like, you're being like literally people like, you rude. What's that for? Why are you doing that? And I shrunk back because I didn't realize that now, as I was slowly but surely becoming part, not only of the community, that I was beginning to do. And also on the other side, I've had times when I remember I spent 15 years in a classroom across 5 different schools, across 5 different movements. And I remember a lot of times when I would express myself in a deeply, not just African-American, but Southern way. I'm not talking the way I talk with my South Carolina people right now, but it doesn't take much to switch that, turn that switch on. But I remember, like, you know, interacting and people, I remember one time, you know how we do we do our own vernacular speech. And it's like, I remember the parent, like, this really condescending thing. I was just like, that's a whole nother thing, I suppose. And she
Right.
says, well, you know, that doesn't sound very intelligent. And I'm just like, sweetie, come on now. Do you want my SAT score or my GRE score? Come on, let's do it. And it was hard because I don't think she understood that I was being comfortable with her to speak in the vernacular. And it when that could have gone way deeper, you know.
Right.
But that's that sense of, there are those times when I think people don't know how to react with the other parts of ourselves.
Right.
And there's also this other thing, which is they don't even realize when you and I and others use things from our intersectional toolbox, and they go, that was amazing. And I go, uh-huh. So what was amazing about it was, what you didn't know was that I pulled that out of that African, that Black part of my toolbox, or that Jewish part, or that gay part, or that Southern part, or that big guy part. And that's what it is. I mean,
Right.
I feel blessed. I don't feel complicated. You know,
Right.
I feel blessed. And I think you do too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always really I like that. I don't feel complicated, because I think so many times people look at people like us and think, wow, that's so interesting. You know, your
Hard. It's so sad.
story is
You
so
know.
interesting. And it's
Mhm.
like, I mean, I guess, but like also it's just who I am. Like, you know, is it interesting that like your parents met somewhere and got married and had kids? Like, is that interesting?
Yeah,
And you know what I mean?
it is. You know, I
Yeah.
tell them like, how are you Jewish? Da, da, da. I said, oh, and this, so you're Jewish by conception. Tell me all about it. That shuts them down real fast.
That's funny.
That's that gay meeting that we talked about. That's another tool.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, you know, when you think about these tools, a lot of the work that I do is around belonging and inclusion and creating spaces
Yes.
that are institutionally go beyond welcoming, because like when you welcome someone, you're still like inviting them into a home that's not theirs, right? Like you welcome someone to your house, you hospitality, hosting, like it's all sort of captured. At the end of the day, they probably like leave. So I think of it more in terms of including, embracing, empowering, words like that. So creating spaces like that. And so much of what I have, you know, people ask me, oh, like, where did you learn to do this? And I'm like, at my dining room table as a kid, like, because this was the conversations that we had when you don't neatly fit into one box. That, you know, these are the conversations that you have of like, what does it look like to have spaces where it's okay to fit into multiple boxes? What does it look like to have spaces where you always show up as yourself, and that people like expect and are excited by that, not are like a little bit trepidatious about it? And what does this mean for the space? How do you create these spaces that can hold people's identities in that way? And so, you know, when we think about this idea of like an intersectional toolkit and where and how it plays itself out, for me, it really, like, you know, so often I have answered that question of like, oh, where do you learn this? With dining room table as a kid. And, you know, just thinking of one thing in particular, you know, both of my parents did this work because I think it also sort of held their identities and held their family. And it's just part of bringing that frame to the spaces you want to be in and the
Uh,
spaces that you are in.
Yeah, I think the question of Jewish learning in particular is very deep because, um, you know, I've had a number of times in my life when I've been praised for knowing something that is really quite simple in Jewish learning terms.
Right.
Or there've been times when I've had people go, like literally blurt out, "You know too much." For who? Or say things like one guy was dominating in Magen David many years ago, and he walks us, so he kind of like says hi. I was like, okay, great. He said hello. That's more than most people do. And then he goes, what do you do? I said, I teach Hebrew school here. And then he goes, you must just teach the basic things. Okay, I don't have time to teach you that how wrong that was, how nonsense that was. But I mean, but the other side is this. For me, you know, Jewish learning has really been centered around the table, and not just the table itself as a place to, you know, have yeshiva time, but the table as you know, I started off as fresh from kite. You know what fresh from kite is? It means that you're Jewish to your stomach. That's how you know that's your loyalty to the mishpucha is to your kishkas, right? And I really began to learn about both sides of myself through going on this journey and looking at it through the lens of food and the culinary. Because in a sense, I was like, I think one thing, okay, I got it now, Tema. You made me have a realization right in the middle of our Zoom.
Oh, I love it.
I feel like this. I feel like the times when I piss people off the most is when in that intersectional toolbox, I use the pieces of my Black and Jewish self that they don't expect. So when I do African American foodways, that's based on the fact that I not only learned deeply about Jewish foodways as an academic subject as discipline first, and then said, how come people don't look at African American or African diaspora foodways with quite the same rigor or the same respect for like the deeper roots and texts behind them, both oral and written. And so I think sometimes the when I've gotten into the deepest trouble, my dear, Gehinom, is when I'm literally looking at something from, say, for example, the soul food tradition that I've really gone deep on, connecting from Africa to American slavery to freedom. And then I'll use one of those tools that I learned in the course of, you know, Jewish food was the start, but then it kind of concentric circles out into every single aspect of halakha, and then also minhagim or customs, and also cultural history, material cultural history in Judaism and Jewish life, and apply those tools. And people go, you can't do that.
Right.
And it's like not the facts. It's you can't imbibe the same spirit into it because we don't like that, because that complicates our perspective on what it means to be you. And if you're not in your box or bubble, what of the system?
Right. Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that this idea of taking frameworks, and I don't think we've actually had this conversation, but a lot of my journey towards sort of the work that I do now started in academic Jewish studies, academic religious studies, studying modern Jewish philosophy, and sort of the questions that you know 20th century Jewish philosophers were asking about what community means after the Holocaust, and sort of pieces like that, but also getting deeper into sort of politics and all of those sorts of frames. So that's very much has shaped my intersectional toolbox, analytic toolkit, whatever language we want to use of the various sort of catchphrases we've been pulling out. But I think there is something really interesting and rich about the fact that when you start in this sort of world of developing a framework to analyze, and then you bring that framework somewhere else where it's kind of unexpected. And, I think also of, a lot of my time, like I said, I spend most of my time in the Jewish world, and the times, for example, where there have been, I'll call them Twitter flare-ups. There's
flashpoints,
flashpoints, flare-ups, whatever language we want to use, is really about moments where I have applied some of those frames, both that I learned as a kid at the dining room table and as an academic, to something going on in our Jewish environs, generally about race, generally about either two things, either who's a Jew, who counts, is a great way to say that, or some sort of a flashpoint in what I guess we would call Black Jewish relations. So, what does it look like? Is there a particular kind of Jewish racism or Black anti-Semitism? And asking questions of that using some of those tools and frameworks that don't necessarily come from sort of Jewish learning in a more traditional sense, that come from that academic frame that I developed and applied, but also, my dad was a civil servant working in race. My mom was a social worker who does a lot of work around race, like from those sort of community development, policy, individual work sort of frameworks, and really having those moments that these things kind of all coalesce and we bring our identities to it. So it's a little bit of both that frame and who's applying it in really unique ways that has gotten, I know I've seen you get in trouble and you've seen me get in trouble. Like it is what it is. But I think that's part of what excites me. And that's part of what keeps me going doing this work, is being able to sort of continue to finesse that approach.
Yeah. Let's talk about some food.
Yeah, I want to hear. So you're like the food guy, and I have the rice cookbook, and I cannot wait to cook the rice pudding. I told you that last week. I said I was going to do it over the weekend, and then I didn't. But I am going to do it soon, so I'm very excited. But yes, tell me. There's so much. I just want to hear you talk about food, but you also, talk a lot about food as text, and I think that that's something that I would love to hear more about, your understanding of food as text. And I think you've talked a little bit about it, but go deeper.
Okay, so for me, one of the things that actually bonds the two foodways traditions, and Kosher Soul is largely about that, my own journeys, but also your journey and other people's journey who have been so vocal about their particular part of the world of being a Jew of color and just being a Jew, period. I mean, that's also important to emphasize, is that we are here living Jewish lives in the same way other people do, and sometimes more intense and more deep, because it's something we cannot take for granted in how we identify and how people receive us. So in terms of food, I think there's a couple different things I need to dispel. First, these two foods are separate. No, when we talk about not that far apart, I remember going to the Walters Art Gallery for an exhibit they did on Blacks in Renaissance Europe, and it was astounding. It was breathtaking, because there it was in front of us, through the art, all the evidence we needed and the stories behind them. And there's this one painting that depicted the ghetto of Lisbon before the full expulsion. And I mean, I had to keep doing this to my eyes, going, I've said this, I've felt this, but here it is in front of me. Here is this ancient painting, and it's from the 1400s. And guess who's in the painting? Black people and Jewish people, and the Jews are identified by the yellow circle. And Black folks, a lot of these folks were coming from West Africa, from Morocco, other parts of North Africa, from Mauritania, from Senegal, and from Cape Verde, and from also Central Africa and Benin. And so you can see all the different ethnicities in the photo, in the picture, right? And they're all interacting. I mean, they're in boats together, and there's a Black knight on a horse, which is, exciting. And there are Jewish prostitutes, and there are Black prostitutes, and there are Jewish women walking with the water in hand, and there are Black women with the water in their head. And there's Jewish police taking away a Black man who is publicly drunk. And there's all everything we think of as being contemporary,
right,
is in that painting. And then, of course, I forget the scholar's name, but I'll just have to blab it later on social media, who's done really deep work showing that early Atlantic world is on the margins of that are these Black folks and these Jewish folks together and apart.
Right.
Because they're there. The Jews who are African are in Italy. Jews who are African are in Amsterdam. Jews who are African are in Spain and in Portugal, the places. And so are the other parts of the Venn diagram. And so so I look at that painting and go, you don't think that they were cooking together? The food was somehow mixing? Right. Wait. So that's so important. And so in doing my work, I'm just looking at food, and in the Jewish. Ethnic Jewish food to me is fascinating. And it's also fascinating how the development of American Jewish food, because American Jewish food is sort of like trans-ethnic in a way. And so is some parts of Israeli food and its connection to Palestinian food. and to European food. I mean, there's all these different things. So I'm going to pull out three big examples. Then we'll just roll with that. Then we'll move on to the next thing. Okay, so the first thing is that I've noticed the shame factor is very much the same between the two cultures. So, it goes like this: the food of the shtetl is looked down upon. Oh, it's brown, it's gray, it's boring. There's no story there. It was just gross. How was that any different from, oh, that's slave food? That's slave food that was thrown down to us. That was the sign of the oppressor. Get rid of it. Burn it all down.
Right.
You know what that really is? I've scratched the surface. This is my opinion, but it's probably true, and I intend to prove it. Is that this is the shame factor? Why did my ancestors fight back? Why were they victims? If they were so great, they would have eaten better. They would have lived better. They would have been prettier. They've been all more awesomer. How could they let themselves get to the point where they were murdered, tortured, annihilated, worked to death, exploited? And it's food in the food. What is it? Food shame? Is that the word they use?
I don't know if there's a particular word, but I think you're bang on of that sort of shared piece of the cultures in general, that, we have that sort of question about how and relationship to being oppressed in many ways, but also in wanting to sort of shed that past oppression in different ways. And, I've never thought of that through the lens of food, but I think you're right. Like all of that stuff that you said about sort of Ashkenazi, especially the Eastern European stuff, and not wanting to, sort of being like, oh, we're going to make this more interesting if we're going to cook this, we're going to spice it up somehow, and oh, it's mushy and it's gross.
It's the same
pepper.
Tema. It's the same kind of food because it's about frugality is important because they didn't have much.
Right.
There's seasonality in the food. My good friends Jeffrey Yoskowitz and Liz Alpern, young people, right? Who have done a really great job of putting on blast the idea that what you're missing is that these foods had regionalisms and variety, and they were connected to spiritual ideas. I mean, Hasidim didn't just eat sugar for no reason in the food. And it's the same kind of thing. I ask myself often about sugar in the Caribbean and African American and Brazilian diet and sugar in the Hasidic diet and the world of Galician Jews. What's going on there? That this thing is not a sweetener, but a seasoning. People forget that too. Here's point number 2. A lot of our other values, like our satirical humor, go into our food. I've often commented that, especially at Pesach, right? There's the black medieval torture, chitlins, and there's the Jewish medieval torture, gefilte fish, and you got to either love them or hate them, right? And so I've said to people, the same conversation goes on with the same people, but just in different contexts. Why do we have to eat that, Zeta? Because when the Tsar was in Russia and da-da-da-da-da, and let's eat it. Fine.
Yeah.
Black conversation. Granddaddy, why we gotta eat them chitlins? Because when we was back on the plantation, we had nothing else to eat, and da-da-da, eat it. And it's almost like we have to eat our oppression to know that it's real. And
I'm a fan of gefilte fish. I love gefilte fish.
Some clubs you can be born in, others you got to join in.
Yeah.
And it's like I laugh at this because we're the only people who, when we eat, we sit there and we talk about at the meal we're having, the meals we had before and the meal we're gonna have next. Nobody else does this. And then when something tastes horrible, it's like this. Black folks, eat this, is nasty. Jewish folks, this is terrible. You have to have some. It's like you have to endure. But then there's point 3. We understand that the solution, the medicine to trauma, is taking pleasure in who we are and our culture.
Yes.
The power of joy, because Ivrit has more words for joy and happiness per capita than English does.
Right.
And it's that idea that this food is about not just comfort, but connection and the generations. They try to kill us, let's eat, is only the surface of it. The other part of it is that there are all these little miracles woven into not only the recipes, but the symbolism behind the foods, the meaning. One last thing I'll say about this. When I went to West Africa multiple times, I've been to 8 different countries, 7 trips. One thing I've learned about food, and particularly about language and food and culture, is that, you know, in Jewish life, we talk a lot about not only the foods of the Seder at Pesach, but also Rosh Hashanah, also Shabbos, also just in general. That, you know, if you do a deep dive, a lot of these foods have their own Jewish folklore. Well, in West Africa, I'm telling you, part of what made me angry-est was after my first, second, and third trips. When I came back from Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, and Cameroon, those 4 trips. And I realized that embedded in the languages of the continent, embedded in the folklore and the proverbs of the people, are all these symbolisms and ideas about each and every single food that tell you libraries about the culture that we were kind of cut off from, but also we did preserve in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States.
Yeah.
And so for me, going back through all of that is looking for the humanity. My writing about food has never just been about the ingredients, techniques, and recipes. It's been about the people. That, you know, the idea that the people are the ones whose stories woven in with the food matter the most.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And there's one thing that I just want to come back to, which is a lot of the conversations that I've been having lately in, I'm going to call them Black Jewish spaces, because they are, generally speaking, conversations like this that happen in front of audiences, but generally speaking, are teasing out of conversations among friends and colleagues that are happening in this community that we are forming with each other, of where we show up as Black and Jewish, is this joy, right? This idea of joy. And I think about it a lot. You know, in the run up to the election, you know, you would see people waiting in line to vote in Philadelphia. This is the one that always comes to my mind. And it was all over Twitter. It was like a lineup of people, of Black people in a Black neighborhood in Philly. And somebody put on some music on, like, out of a car window, I guess. I don't know. They didn't show where the music was coming from, and everyone just starts dancing, and they're waiting to vote, and they're dancing. And, you know, we're in the middle of a pandemic. You know, it was a very stressful time leading up to the election. It was all the stuff about, like, are the ballots going to count? Like, all of this is happening, and there's just this overpouring of joy, of joy. And so all over Twitter, it was Black joy, Black joy, Black joy. And not long after that, I went to a panel with a bunch of Black Jewish artists. And out of this panel emerged this idea of, what does Black Jewish joy look like? What does it look like? Like, yeah, okay, we can show up with Black joy, we can show up with Jewish joy, but what is it? You know, this was coming up to Hanukkah. What does it look like because we all understand Black joy as this outflowing out of adversity, of being joyous in the face of it all, which I think is very similar to, you know, the Jewish sort of joke about the holidays. They tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat, right? The table just being a place of cooperative overlapping, to say the least, of the conversations around every Jewish table I've ever been at. And what does it look like, that combination of that outflowing? And I know we need to leave time for questions. So I just want to leave that as a thought for everyone. But I want to spend some time with, like, the last piece of what I know is so important to both of us, which is our experiences in institutional spaces. And both of us spend a lot of time in Jewish spaces. And I think there's a lot of questions that we have, and opportunities that we recognize about making those spaces safer, more embracing, more representative for Jews of color, but mostly in particular for our personal experiences for Jews of African descent. I talk about this all the time. And it's, there's so many ways that we can do this. But I would love to hear, this is actually not a conversation you and I have had. So I would love to hear, you've spent so much time in those spaces, what that would look like for you.
I think that well, I kind of want to respond to one thing really quickly about Black Jewish joy. I think Black Jewish joy is when Rebecca talks about making the Africoman. I think Black Jewish joy is when someone sings the Kaddish to "I Just Called to Say I Love You" and does a Stevie Wonder. I think Black Jewish joy is when Chase and I talk, Chase Rashard and I, Rabbi Chase Rashard and I talk about whose kosher soul food is better. I think my matzo meal and fried chicken is like bomb, but we gonna have to have that fight out in person one day after the pandemic.
I'm coming.
Yes, you are.
I'm inviting myself.
Absolutely. No, that's the thing. I think Black Jewish joy is when Black Jewish congregations who have been here for quite some time, break out into I don't want to use the term gospel because it's not appropriate, but that African American sacred music version of Jewish liturgy. Mm-hmm. And the moment of redemption and cleansing is spiritual and rousing, and it doesn't end. Right. And I think Black Jewish joy is when, we see each other and we recognize in one another some similar journeys and feel our own sense of familyhood with each other. Yeah. And I think Black Jewish joy is when one of my students was like, when we were in Ethiopia, not when those Black Jews in Ethiopia, no, when we, including all of us. Mm-hmm. Or the last one I'll say is that for me personally, it was the moment when one of my students, my middle schoolers came in and he was like, I almost got into a fight with a kid at school because of you. And I'm like, well, what did I do? And he said that the kid said there were no Black Jews. He says, excuse me, my teacher in Hebrew school is Mr. Twitty, and he's the greatest. And here's a picture of him and I. And those kind of things, I don't think people realize that in a responsible multicultural society, you have an obligation to respect and amplify the outlier, the border crosser, and the forgotten. I am paraphrasing Tanakh. The orphan and the widow. Yes, that's exactly what I was doing there. I want you to understand that these folks exist and their stories deserve to be told. I'm here only because I'm here talking to my good friend Tema Smith, only because someone wanted to go against the grain when people literally told me, your thing ain't a thing. You're too niche. You muddy the waters. You're too complicated. Told in professional situations that would have derailed my American dream. Okay? Because someone said, you're too much because I can't deal with that. I can't deal with all of these crossroads being in one person. And I think it's so poor. I've talked about the Jewish journey thing, and maybe that's been amplified in other places. But I think if you're going to ask of somebody who you want to be curious about, you think it's exotic, to testify to their journey, you best be ready to testify to yours. Right. I mean, here's the bottom line. What is it like to walk into these spaces? Particularly, I'm only going to speak for myself in this context. I'm not really trying to get on anybody else's toes. But here's the bottom line. To go into a synagogue space and you're the only one that gets patted down or get asked for multiple forms of ID. And by the way, not by some white person, but by the other person of color working behind that desk.
Yeah.
What is it like to be the only Black figure of authority that most of my students ever had growing up? I was the only Black man they called sir and called Mr. And that's a big deal. I mean, you have to understand that by fomenting the opportunity for people of African descent and people of color to be teachers, to be principals, to be school officials in Jewish settings, to be Jewish clergy, to be Jewish, like Tema, having worked within synagogue communities, that is so important. Because I remember what it was like to basically everybody kind of nudge me and go, what's up with this Black-white thing? That ain't our problem. That may be your problem outside this shul.
Right.
And But Tema, here's the deal. The summer of Black Lives Matter happened. And all these folks were like, well, Michael, can you talk to, wait a minute, hold up. I was the one you told not to talk to these children about this. Right. I was the one you told that didn't belong in a Jewish space. I was the one so which one is it? Is it because it's trendy, it's hot, it's interesting, it's something that you want me to have a conversation about that now? Or can you just sit down and be quiet and recognize with me that it's always been a part, the color line has always been an issue in our community, in this country. You cannot exist as Jews in North America, in either of our countries, our dual countries, right? You cannot exist without addressing this with a Du Boisian issue of the color line. It just doesn't happen that way. And to pretend that up until 2020, this is a conversation. Yavilla McCoy, read her, what is it? Her list, the list of sins about being, read that text that so many synagogues had the courage to put out in Yom Kippur. That text is not new. That text was written years ago. And that text still applies to the way we need to view this. I mean, Tema, I have said this over and over again. The Jewish community, from modern Orthodox down to Jewish renewal, has had various conversations about gender and about sexual orientation. But we've been here the whole time. We've been here since the 17th century, when the first Jew, who was also Black, by the way, was profiled and arrested in Boston. Hello. Yeah. Solomon, the mulatto Jew. They spelled Jew wrong, of course.
Yes.
And I mean, that's not coincidence.
Right.
That's just our history. And so I will finish answering your question by saying this. Jewish communities need to have the pictures up that show diversity and not token diversity. Jewish communities need to recognize and come to grips with the fact that the community might have been larger had rabbis in New York and other places accepted the birth of biracial Jews who were in fact luckily Jewish. We need to come to grips with the fact that we have our own unique issues, from Toronto to New York to Chicago to the South, that we have to have. It has to be more than just a Black History Month or whatever conversation. It has to be a year-long conversation about the fact that we bring life and energy and newness and connectivity to this community too. And last but not least, when we do any sort of work involving Black-Jewish relations, I'm not going to say the name of any organizations to get people in trouble, but I'm going to say this. It's not just those Black Christians and these white Jews.
Right.
That is so old hat, so tired, so bothersome, so boring, so wrong, that if anybody ever has a conversation about Black-Jewish relations without bringing people like us into the fold, it is a faulty and corrupt conversation we should have nothing to do with, because it's a false parallel.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that is so true. And it disturbs me how much that sort of dialogue model still prevails, that excludes the middle, excludes the overlap, excludes the intersection. And the other thing that, has become so clear to me in my years of doing this work is that as a Jewish community, we are not bad at saying, yeah, we're going to show up for criminal justice reform. We're going to put together a committee, and we're going to show up, and we're going to partner with that Black church down the street, and we're going to show up and do racial justice work. And then you say, okay, where are the Black Jews in your neighborhood that aren't coming to your synagogue? And they're like, I don't know. And it's like, well, maybe we need to do the work inside. We're very good at making it an American problem or a Canadian problem, because I'm in Canada. We're very good at making it a problem that we only are passively a part of, rather than actually looking at the ways that it has infected the world that we occupy, number one. And by not actually taking that look, propagating what happens outside. And, an example that I always think of was, there's so many examples from, I was a synagogue professional for 8 years. I worked in another Jewish organization for 3.5 years prior to that. And like little things, like people just not understanding why I would get excited that I met another Black Jew, or there would be a learning opportunity for Jews of color, and not understanding why, yeah, okay, it might not have been like an organizational priority, but why it might have been a Tema priority to go and be with these people. And really sort of moments like that throughout the years of really not understanding, because if you've always been around people who are like you don't understand what it's like for the people who have never been around people like them. And I think that's something we need to grapple with in our spaces. I knew tons of mixed race kids as a kid, but none of them were Jewish. And the Jewish kids I knew were all white. And so, what does it look like? And one of the things that I've been so grateful for, and actually I think the pandemic has strengthened this community that we've built amongst ourselves even more because we've all moved digital, is the way that the internet has created what we didn't necessarily have the resources to create on our own.
Right.
And there's just so much that we can go into, but to me, I think those are the biggies about beginning that work of making the spaces not just safe, but like home.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Sorry to butt in. My name is Saul Zaret, Associate Professor of Yiddish Literature at Harvard. I'm here to help with the Q&A. This has been an amazing conversation. Thanks so much for all that you've shared and the amazing and challenging questions that you've asked. And now our audience gets a chance to challenge you guys with some more questions, hopefully ones that will be productive and add to the conversation. And building off of stuff you just were talking about, some of our earliest questions that came in, we're thinking maybe to return us back to the question of the Venn diagram. A number of people wanted to hear more about the Venn diagram. And one of the important questions that came up from a number of people in the audience was, who is more responsible for the different parts of the diagram, of the Venn diagram, or for the possibility of sharing? Who among the different parts of the Black and Jewish, Black on one side, Jewish on one side, Black and Jewish happening at the same time, where does the responsibility come in for changing the conversation or reasserting the prominence of the Venn diagram or the possibility of it?
Everybody. I think one of the things that I've frequently said is that, yeah, it gets tiring to get a lot of strange questions and weird questions, but you know something of it, sometimes you have to be the educator. It's like, this is part of the teamwork. And that's a lot of people, I know a lot of people who said to me in the course of my life, hey, Twitty, I'm Jewish. Like, they came out at class like, wait a minute, I've known you quite some time. Yeah, but you know something, drama in my family, I'm mixed race, drama in my family, but I could have had a bat mitzvah, I could have had a bar mitzvah, but I didn't do it because it was so uncomfortable and da 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 da. And it struck me, there was this, part of the tragedy is, I think there's a lot of people in the Jewish community who pass Jews who they may not just be of color, they might be white and passing and don't know that they're Jewish and don't know the stories and struggles they've gone through because of interfaith conflict and issues, because of other issues, and they don't know it. So even it's very easy to say, you know what, Black folks need to be responsible for this, Jewish folks need to be responsible for this, but all of us need to be responsible for this. But for us who are living this, part of being, like I said before, part of being in a multicultural society is taking responsibility for our awareness of each other, our awareness of ourselves, and mitigating conflict so that things like these flashpoints and acts of violence don't overwhelm us and don't happen because we haven't had the conversation. In real estate, the three words are location, location, location. In our interactions with each other in culture and spirituality and identity, the words are context, context, context. And we don't get taught that in school. We don't, and every time we try to advocate for it, it's a culture war. Right. So what we need to do is take the responsibility upon ourselves to a point, because as Tema will probably say in the next few seconds, it can be toxic and overwhelming to be that educator all the time. But at the same point in time, the balance is that you gotta have, sometimes you have to have your answers ready, because sometimes when you got your stuff together and you're ready to handle people's issues and their isht, you know what it does? It makes you feel calm when you go, I got that. I did that. I was calm. I was patient. I gave them the message. Now it's up to them to take their issues and make a new subscription.
Yeah. I love that. And I think, you know, one of the things I will say most of my time is spent in Jewish space. And therefore for me, like Michael said, the responsibility is all around. But for me, my work, my passion is about creating those Jewish spaces that in a way that are more inclusive and embracing. And so for me, I think that I don't think that there's necessarily responsibility is the language I would use, so much as partnership. It's dialogue, it's partnership. It's yes, there are people who have power and authority to make change, to push the conversation forward, of course. And so the responsibility ultimately lies with the thought leaders, the authority figures, the people with like named positions. That's where sort of responsibility lies. But the actual process of sort of embracing the center of the Venn diagram, if that's how we want to view it, is actually a process of dialogue, of relationship. And I think, you know, one of the things that has been so meaningful to me has been to be able to step into the role of teacher, of conversation haver. And I think what I think a challenge of this, though, is that as people are trying to sort of understand what it means to make change, they go to the people who just want to show up, rather than the people who are putting themselves out there to sort of push the conversation forward. And I think there needs to be a recognition that like some people who are Black and Jewish just literally want to show up in a synagogue and pray and have some food and go home. They don't want to move the conversation about race forward. And then there's a whole bunch of us out there who are happy to do it. And so sort of recognizing that. And that's why I think, you know, I really emphasize that relationship piece, because it is in relationship with people that you understand, is this the person who wants to have the conversation or not?
Right.
I guess sort of to push this in a different direction, even though I think one of the things that's coming out of this conversation is that there isn't exactly a division between inside and outside, an internal conversation and external one, that these conversations sort of bleed into different directions, that everyone is an insider and an outsider potentially at the same time.
Right.
But a lot of people are asking about how to think about that Venn diagram, but then radiating it outwards, especially to talk about these two sins of Western civilization that Michael mentioned, of anti-Semitism and anti-Blackness. How can the conversations that happen internally, or that need to happen, or that should happen internally within a Jewish community, be then related, you know, how can they spread outwards, or what can those conversations do to combat anti-Blackness and anti-Semitism simultaneously, separately, or in some kind of conjunction?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about this. And I think I'm going to start with one of the mistakes, because I think when we understand one of the big mistakes, we understand a little bit faster how to do this well and right. Is I think a lot of people, because of the nature of what it means to face discrimination, oppression, hate, want their issue to be foregrounded. And in order to foreground their issue, like people see it as like a zero-sum game. People have an attention span of 100 and we want 90. And so people compete with each other to foreground their concerns and say, like, why are we talking about anti-Black racism and not talking about anti-Semitism? That's what I see a lot. And what I see a lot when I talk about anti-Black racism in communities is I actually now have a slide on the talk that I give that is like flashpoints and derailings. And one of them is, but what about anti-Semitism? Another one is, but what about Israel? Because those are the two biggies that come out every time. And I think it's a process of simultaneously recognizing that we can center our concerns about not being hated without centering ourselves at all times. And especially the way that hate functions in North America, it kind of all bubbles up from a shared source. And, you know, some of the stuff that has just made that abundantly clear to me is, for example, the now dead and buried 1776 project. There was a whole section about like the culture war, which was about critical race theory and, you know, those evil identity politics people in a nutshell. But there was a very odd reconfiguration of the white supremacist idea of the Great Replacement myth, which literally means that, you know, when they marched in Charlottesville, the Jews will not replace us. They weren't saying that Jews are going to outnumber white people. They were saying that Jews are going to flood America with undesirable elements to replace white people, right? Just to sort of clarify that. And it showed up in a very subtle way in the 1776 Project by saying these Jewish Marxist immigrants from Europe came and were the Frankfurt School, and they taught the original critical race theorists, who are all Black leftist scholars, picked up their ideas and are using them, you know, to make us all think about diversity and racism and undermine the roots of American society. That is an intellectualized version of the Great Replacement myth. And I think when we let that discourse take over, that somehow it's Marxism that's driving the conversation, or it's critical race theory, it's identity politics driving the conversation, we're actually fueling racism and anti-Semitism. So understanding the intricacies of how that argument plays itself out is so key. I could go on, like, I literally have a 2-hour talk that I do on this topic, so I'm going to say one last thing and then let Michael jump in on it. The other is understanding the ways that anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism function differently and look different from each other, which doesn't make one worse than the other. I think we all want to say, well, this group has it worse. Frankly, I don't particularly care who has it worse, as long as anyone has it bad, right? Like, we all should have it good. That would be the ideal. Ranking who's more oppressed doesn't get anyone anywhere except for groups fighting each other. And so really understanding the nuance of how these things play themselves out, and acknowledging that anti-Semitism can show up in non-Jewish Black community, the same that anti-Black racism can show up in non-Black Jewish community. So that is my 3-hour, 2-hour, however long talk.
Tune in again next time. Right? Tune in next time for Tema's longer talk.
I want to put it like this. I still believe in that word responsibility, because I've been, you know, I haven't had anything major happen to me, but I remember what it was like to be hit in the head in the store for having a keep on. And I remember when I, you know, and I used to wear tzitzis all the time outside of my shirt. I remember what it was like to be on DC Metro and have the fundamentalist Christians from Pennsylvania and West Virginia who were coming for the Women's Lives March, which was about reproductive rights, see me riding on the Metro up to Rockville to Potomac to go to Hebrew school and to teach. And they saw me saying Tehillim. And I was attacked because I had a circular African Ugandan kippah on. At first I thought I was Muslim, and they were really loud about it. It wasn't just like one person, it was 20 of them, one of me, and in a so-called chocolate city, now Mocha City, and a diverse train, nobody said a damn thing to help me.
Right.
And that was the first and last time I wanted to be in this situation, but also if I ever saw anyone in a situation, what I would do for them. And it was remarkable. This is before we were all so-called woke. And I tell people all the time, I ain't woke, I'm rooted. Because these feelings that I get, the antenna that we spark that come from our history, from our ancestors, to save us, to rescue us in these moments of turmoil. People don't understand what to do, how to do. Moment taught me that in movies, everybody's so bold and heroic and brave. In reality, they don't want to get hurt. They don't want to get shot. They don't want to get cut. They don't want to get yelled at. They don't want to get called those names, but they'll let me get it because I'm supposed to be able to take it. And the bottom line is that we have a lot of work to do. You know, like I said before, if you're going to be in a multicultural society, you have a responsibility to understand and love thy neighbor, understand thy neighbor, protect the outlier, the border crosser, and the forgotten. And we all have to do this work, because sometimes we don't know, like, who we're harming with our language, who we're harming with our acts, and who we're harming with our aversion to getting involved. And so all of that's in there. I think everything we're saying is part of a conversation that we need to have in both communities and within the Jewish community and as Jews of color, period. Because I think in many ways we are these ambassadors. I'm glad you made the distinction between those of us who just want to just live and those of us who are happy to be voices. But then again, Tema, we have to challenge the community to amplify those voices because they're there. That's the thing. It's not that there aren't enough people to do that work while other people can, chill. It's that a lot of times programs like this are rare in a world where we don't often get able to speak, not just as Black Jews or Jews of color, but as Jews, period.
Right.
As Jews, period. And I think some of the things, the flashpoints that we've seen in social media as Jews of color is this idea that you need to prove your validity and authenticity by going the hard line. That's one huge problem. And what happens is if you don't go the hard line, you are now suspicious. Mm-hmm. And I've seen this sort of toxic back and forth, between the language of these two communities, this kind of protexia. I've seen that a lot of our frenemies, well, they ain't really frenemies, on social media have used Black protexia, which I have issues with as a Black man. I ain't gonna go there in this talk, to sort of like throw that Molotov cocktail right on back at us if we don't agree with everything they say. I mean, I can't even tell you the number of times I've left myself out of global politics for a reason, because I can't take that. I can't deal with that heat. I got enough trouble trying to cook in the kitchen and deal with that heat, let alone other heat. But if people message me and go, why aren't you doing enough about Israel? I said, I've been there twice. I put my money, my time, and my life in going there twice. I'll go there again, Bezrat Hashem. But I'm not here to debate those issues. I'm here because I love Israeli food, I love Palestinian food, and I love both people. And I just want to eat and talk about how we can bring peace and goodness into the world through interaction with food. And also with being Black and Jewish, the same thing. I'm not here to advocate for anybody's nonsense. I'm not here to get into any fight, especially because I'm an American. I'm living here on this soil, in this place, in this time. So it's just, Saul, there's too much to do and too much to talk about.
I know. Let's change it a little bit to talking more about food, because we got to give ourselves something to nosh on to sort of give us the sustenance to do the kind of work that you're calling us to do. So we have a number of questions about food, and there's one here about the Seder, which is coming up. So are there any non-traditional, I don't know exactly what that means, but customs or foods that you include in your Seder to make it particularly rich and meaningful? Or share with us something that you're excited for your Pesach table coming up soon.
The first thing I should say is that I don't think there is any such thing as non-traditional within Judaism, because guess what? All of our traditions started off as, let's try it. And then next thing you know, it kept going. And then it became a minhag, and then it became a halacha. And then it was like part of us. But the Seder is the funniest one, right? Because we both know not a damn thing in Haggadah is in the Torah commandments about Pesach. Everything, I'm not trying to insult your question. I'm just trying to be real. Like, even
this is from the audience, so it's not
no, not you. I'm speaking to that audience member. Right. But I'm just like, even our language. One linguist joked, and he's not joking. He said even Hebrew is Judeo-Canaanite. Nope, can't get away from it. We are Am Segula, and yet we're still very much a part of the world. So for me, I'll quickly talk about my Seder plate that I put out every year. I put out 2 Seder plates. One is an African-American Seder plate, one's the more traditional Seder plate. But yet on that so-called traditional Seder plate, I also keep that orange there because I am a queer person. I also now do the olive oil, for peace. I do all of them. I throw all of them on there. It's like the plate is getting crowded. Those of you who do Jewish material culture, you need to invent a bigger plate. And the African-American plate, I do so quickly: salt, water. The water's the Middle Passage. The sweet potato is the karpas, because of its, the sweet potato / yam, because of its significance in the bridge between Africa and America. For the hazeret, which some people have as horseradish, I use red pepper, because the red pepper is one of those transatlantic ingredients which signifies in Senegal the truth. They say the Wolof say the truth is a hot pepper. And so the hot pepper is often used in spiritual and proverbial symbolism in West Africa to talk about power, truth. But it's also like if you know African, Caribbean, Brazilian, Haitian, African American food, hot pepper and hot sauce are central. The collard green is my maror, my bitter herb. My haroset, I can have peanuts because I converted Sephardic. Hi, good luck with that. And so, by the way, it's the only time of year I eat Snickers bars. I don't eat candy. On Pesach, I gladly eat a Snickers bar every day just to celebrate the fact that I'm kidney out all the time. And so I do peanuts and molasses. Again, goober pea, right? It's a Native American crop that went to Africa that came back on the slave ship to the South and was called by African names. But at the same time, you have the molasses, which is symbolic of my bond with Tema is sugarcane and how that brought Africans to America. However, I forgot the Beitzah is actually cool because the egg is one of the few symbols that doesn't really change very much. So in the Khan religion tradition, the creator, Onyame, the creator, is symbolized with the sacrifice of the egg. And in Judaism, the egg symbolizes the sacrifice. And instead of the zoroah, the lamb shank bone, I have the chicken bone, which for me is the chicken is one of those foods in Jewish and Black tradition. I don't know what Jews or Blacks would do without chicken. It's like, okay, or Puerto Ricans. I mean, it's like New York Unify around the chicken, and then the Great Migration is symbolized by the shoebox lunch that people had on their way north to move to a better life. It was, you would make a thing of fried chicken or whatever, and then you put it in there with biscuit, cornbread, with some potato salad or something, and you would literally be handed a shoebox by your mother, by your grandmother. And that was a ritual act of these women and these men going north, going to the Midwest, or going to the West Coast, these long train rides where they could not eat with white folks. And so that's that symbol of, all these symbols are about freedom, about creating survival in exile, and also taking joy in how you overcome. Because as I always like to say, our greatest form of capital as Blacks, as Jews, also as gay men and other folks, is how we survive our oppression, our greatest currency. And that takes the form of our food, our art, our dance, our sexuality, all these things that we take pleasure and joy in that go out to the world as, wow, they did that, is partly because of our own inherent sense of joy and confidence, who we are without the subject of oppression, but also our survival of it.
I like that last comment because it spoke to a question that my student submitted. So I wanted to make sure that my student got her question in, but you answered it very beautifully just then. Another food question before I give you guys some last chance at comments is that someone has submitted they're interested in their Black Louisiana food traditions, which has a lot of shellfish and pork, but also with the observance of kashrut. So they're looking for how to think about their identities through food, but also meeting some of the sort of halachic challenges that might come with it. If you had any advice or thoughts about it.
Yes.
So Michael's territory. I love it.
Yes.
It's so good. I'm like listening in there.
So I have a good friend, you know her, Tema, Hava in LA. She's on East Coast. She's been talked a lot about Black Jewish issues. She's originally from Louisiana. Her husband's Jamaican. And they're both very, very observant Orthodox Jews. And we talk about this, I actually interviewed her for the book. One thing I want to say to people is, number one, please get rid of this little myth. People go, oh my God, how can you cook soul food without pork? And I'm like, hey guys, there in West Africa, pork is not a common food at all. In Central Africa, not that common. East Africa, not that common. It's there, but it's not really that common. So some of you are talking about Luanda and other places. I'm sure that's Portuguese territory. That's different. Most of West Africa, Muslim. Most of West Africa, English and French speaking, not the same food culture. So let's talk about that. Number two, pork wasn't even like the center of the diets in the early part of our history of African-American vernacular foodways. So the most important part is smokiness, right? It's umami. It's okay to make greens without a whole side of ham, for God's sakes. You know, smoked turkey is just as good in the kosher market as good anywhere else, and it makes the greens taste just as good. I don't care what nobody says. Okay, that little myth is done. The other part of it is that I found it was interesting that the biggest group that has reached out to me over the years has been white Southern Jews who grew up Protestant. Because they're like, Michael, I can't do this without my food. Our food is so important of being Southern. And I said, I understand. So, me personally, I cook predominantly kosher by the book, sort of, in my house. When I do my historic interpreter thing, I cook other things because I haven't yet found ample research interpretation of what it meant to be a free person of color who was Jewish, or a Black person who's cooking in a Jewish household, enslaved or free. When I do, I'm doing that. I'm stamping, I'm monopolizing that like nobody's business. But the research is really spotty at this point. But the best I can say is this: it's more about the flavor and it's more about the intent than the ingredients themselves. That's the tradition. And your imagination, improvisation, that is definitely African-American tradition. And your ability to make these traditions come alive is hiddur mitzvah. Okay, that's making the mitzvah of celebrating the Hayim more beautiful. My students used to tell me, Mr. Twitty, if there's ever going to be a Black Jewish preacher, it's going to be you. And I said, I know, and I hate that, but it's the truth. Thank you for pointing that out. But there's plenty of good kosher surimi out there. I had some of the best shrimp gumbo in my life in a kosher, what was it called? Kosher Cajun, used to be in Metairie, Louisiana. So you can do it. You can make it happen. There's so many good. And make sure you get a copy of, what was her name? Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, guys. I'm forgetting her name at this last second. We got to run soon. And I wish I could look over at my bookcase to see her name, but the books are in the other room. The cookbook's in the room. But I'll give it to y'all later. It's a series of books by this lovely lady who I met, who's no longer with us, who was born and raised in Louisiana. Her mother was right off the boat from Galicia. And she wrote the Kosher Creole Cookbook, the Kosher Southern Cookbook, and the Kosher Cajun Cookbook. So you got resources and you got me. So thank you for that question.
All right, I want to give either of you last chance to say anything you want before we close up the evening. Any last thoughts?
Tema, go ahead.
All right. I think for me, one of the things that I'm going to say scares me the most is this has been a wonderful, very busy, can't believe the pandemic's a year already, of having conversations about Blackness and Jewishness, and about about racism, and about Jews' role in fighting anti-Black racism, and all of these things. I've been talking about this publicly, in writing, in places where people can read it, for over a decade. And it's the last year where I feel like people all of a sudden are like, ding, 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 this is a thing we should pay attention to. I've seen like little bits kind of bubbling up over the last number of years, but nothing like what has happened. And yes, some of it is the, trying to fill space that would have been, programs on site with people who you can now zoom in, whatever. I understand that part of it. But my biggest fear is that one day we'll be able to be in person again, and, or people will just get tired of talking about race and racism, and these conversations will stop happening. And when that happens, people like Michael, people like me are still here and are still trying to make that community reach that level where, ideally one day the conversations about race and racism and building an inclusive community can stop, because ideally one day we achieve that. But the conversations about showing up with as our full selves and things like that should just be part of the fabric of Jewish life. And so for me, I'm just going to leave everyone with that. I guess it's a call to action to make sure this doesn't stop. This has been just, the people I've been able to be in dialogue with, the places I've been able to speak, it's been just such, I'm going to say a relief to talk about my experiences, to talk about my knowledge and what I want for us so frequently to such receptive audiences of people who feel the same way. And it's on all of us. I'm gonna go back to that idea of responsibility. It is on all of us, every single one of us, to make sure that this does not stop, because there's too much to lose. There's too much to lose. And my last thought on that is that if we lose this momentum, that will feel even worse than when we weren't talking about it in the first place.
That's
So
right.
just being aware of that and being aware that we have built something up where people are finally feeling seen. And just imagine all of a sudden somebody recognizes your experience and then all of a sudden they're like, how much worse that would feel than the time when just nobody recognized your experience in the beginning.
Right.
Michael, any last thoughts?
So one of my favorite midrash is the story of one of the Hazal, one of the rabbis that was at work planting, Zaitim, planting olive trees, right? And everybody rushes up to him and says, "Come on, Mashiach is here." He's like, "You know what? If the Mashiach is coming, he's gonna come by my house. So he's gonna roll by here. So guess what? Y'all can go meet the Mashiach. I got olive trees to plant for the future generations." And it's that kind of like point blank realism that the ongoing nature of the work is nonstop. And that it gets a little bit better to change. Sometimes it reverses. And that's what we dealt with now. I feel I've apologized, Saul, to students here, like the kind of students that you teach. I tell them all the time, I'm 44 and I'm really sorry the world is shittier. That the very things, particularly in terms of identity, color, race, gender, sexual orientation, we were on an up climb. Now we've regressed, and we need to figure that out. But the thing that makes me happy, and I'll close with this, that makes me feel really glad, is that we do have these resources that were paid for by thousands of years of innovation and persistence and resistance. One of the best things about food for me is, look, if someone is stupid and their race is anti-Semitic, all I gotta do is put my food into their mouth. While they're chewing, I shut them up. And therefore, that I have that time to educate them or to bring peace into the world, however it may be. But this is about, I want people to realize, people like Tema and myself are mishpacha too. We're not just mishpacha that look different, we're just mishpacha. We're family. And we are no different than the people who came before us and the stories that they have to bring. And we have so much to offer collectively as part of the Jewish people. And also, we're also people who educate people who are not Jewish about Judaism. And we need to be respected and thanked for that. Because we I know Tema does this. We fix a lot of myths out there in the world just by being us. And we're not saying we're not problematic. I know I'm taking respect for my problematic nature, Tema. I'm talking about you, sister.
I'm stubborn and outspoken. I mean, I've got my stuff. Don't worry.
But the bottom line, Saul, is that we do this out of love, and we do this because this is our people too, and our future too, and that's about it. And everybody, if I don't see you, Hag Zameach.
Thanks so much to both of you. Thank you so much for your generosity. The one comment that came in is that it's Mildred Covert and Sylvia Gerson are the authors of those great Southern Jewish cookbooks. So I just wanted to thank you both on behalf of the Center for Jewish Studies and the Hutchins Center. I want to thank everyone who works behind the scenes and all of those things. I'm not going to name everyone because it's a lot of people, but I do want to thank all of you. And I know it's late, so I want to let everyone go. I also want to thank everyone who's still on the call for joining us and for your many number of amazing questions. We weren't able to get to all of them, so thank you so much. And to plug very quickly to tune into our next event, which will be on April 19th, I think at the same time, either 4 or 5, we'll have to look it up, and that'll be on Black and Jewish activist voices. So the conversation continues, and thank you so much to everybody for coming, and thanks to our speakers again. So not everybody, you can't hear the claps, but I'll clap for everybody in the audience for you. Take care, everybody.
Take care.